time has finally arrived to pull the curtains for our first event, Malaysia Solve Climate by 2030, Green Recovery, Climate Solutions and a Just Transition. Ladies and gentlemen, this is no ordinary event. There are 125 similar events held across the planet in early April as part of the global project called Solve Climate by 2030, sponsored by Bard College in New York in collaboration with the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, or APRU. Participating countries range from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, Colombia to Malaysia, and South Africa to Hungary. Now, during this webinar, 3 Malaysia's thought leaders in climate action will share their thoughts and experience. What is exciting is that the sneak preview of the UM-Nottingham bite-sized climate action online modules for Malaysian youth platform that is currently underdeveloped will be launched. So let us view this video prepared by the sponsors, and immediately after the video, Associate Professor Dr. Theseira, one of Malaysia's active sustainability science experts, will come on board to welcome you to the webinar. Enjoy the journey and the experience.
So as a resident in the western suburbs of Sydney, one of the most prominent impacts of climate change would have to be the increasing intensity and frequency of heat waves. And in particular, I realized that when you live in energy inefficient or poorly designed buildings, it's very difficult to stay cool and safe during these sweltering periods. And that's translated to me into an awareness of how the impacts of climate change are spatially differentiated, disproportionately impacting marginalized, disadvantaged communities or people in peripheral spaces.
So I might be studying in Japan now, but I'm actually coming from France, from the southern region, the French Alps. In recent years, the winters have got a lot warmer. We're getting a lot less snowfall. Biodiversity in the mountain has become a lot less diverse. This is a threat for my community because in my home, tourism is the main source of revenue and the main economy.
The effects of climate change in the country are manifested and felt in our food supply and in the varying weather in the country. For example, extreme drought or extreme flooding brought about by climate change can gravely affect the productivity of our agriculture and fisheries sector. More so, global warming also intensified the calamities that we face. For example, super typhoon, which isn't something that we would consider as normal 10 years ago. But because of the continuous warming of the ocean, we are now unfortunately expecting it to hit us at least once a year.
This is urgent. There is no time to lose. We have to make sure that this planet is safe for humans to live. For everyone, not just the rich. I'm Chris Tremuran from APRU. We are a network of 57 universities around the Pacific Ocean, Asia, North and South America, Australia and New Zealand. Many of you are joining Solve Climate by 2030. We can do this and we can do much more. Together we can make a difference. Let's do it.
I actually believe that everyone can do a little bit of something to fight climate change.
We've seen how the climate crisis is mobilizing an entire new generation of active performative citizens, with students in schools and universities acting in solidarity and participating in protests, demanding change.
Also, we must demand accountability from big-scale polluters such as the big companies who dominate the market and the government who leads the country, because as long as these two refuse to act upon it and neglect the reality of climate change, all our individual efforts such as tree planting or shifting to a zero waste and green lifestyle will all be disregarded, because fighting a big and complex issue such as climate change requires collective action.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Yvonne Lim, for the kind introduction. Assalamualaikum, warm greetings and a very good afternoon. Taking this opportunity as well to wish our Muslim viewers Salam, first day of Ramadan. Welcome everyone to the Solve Climate by 2030 webinar hosted by University of Malaya. I'm Zida from the UM Department of Science and Technology Studies, Faculty of Science. I'm the coordinator for this webinar together with the wonderful technical team from UM International Relations Office and UM Water Warriors. Solve Climate by 2030 is a simultaneous global dialogue aimed at seeking climate solutions at the local level and through personal actions. The main organizer is the Center of Environmental Policy at Bard College in the US, with support from the Open Society University Network, and universities all over the world, like University of Malaya, is joining in as international collaborators. Now, what is so innovative about the Solve Climate by 2030 webinar is the fact that it is being hosted in collaboration with more than 100 universities simultaneously within a week worldwide, with the projected audience of about 100,000 students all over the world. Very exciting indeed that we are part of this global movement. Specifically, in our webinar today entitled Malaysia Solve Climate 2030, Green Recovery, Climate Solutions and a Just Transition, three of Malaysia's thought leaders in climate action, Dr. Gary Theseira, representing the government, Dr. Yasmin Rasyid from the civil society, and Mr. Benjamin Ong from the United Nations Development Programme and a former student leader in UM, will share their thoughts and experiences on how state, community, and individual actions can put us on the path to solving climate change by 2030. Our deepest appreciation to the panelists for taking time to be with us today, even with their incredibly busy schedules. The webinar will be moderated by a wonderful colleague, Dr. Helena Varkkey, a senior lecturer at UM's Department of International and Strategic Studies, Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. Helena's research area is on the political economy and sustainable governance of natural resources, particularly relating to the palm oil industry and transboundary haze pollution in Southeast Asia. Helena is also currently the project leader of an exciting collaborative project between University of Malaya and University of Nottingham, Malaysia, called the Bite-Sized Climate Action Online Modules for Malaysian Youth, and therefore I believe would be the best person to moderate the session. But before we hand over the screen to Helena, we will first listen to a 5-minute video in which Dr. Eban Goodstein, who is the Solve Climate by 2030 initiative co-producer and the director at the Center of Environmental Policy at Bard College, who will introduce the aim, objectives, and vision of this global dialogue. Let us first listen to Eban, and then we will hand over the screen to Helena. Enjoy.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 US states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Eban Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice, and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinar's homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world, asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
Thank you, Dr. Zida, and hello everyone. I'm Helena from the Department of International Strategic Studies of Universiti Malaya. Good evening to all of you. I also like to wish our Muslim viewers a safe and meaningful first day of Ramadan. Happy Varkkey, and also happy Songkran to those who are celebrating as well. It's a very special day today. So I'm very happy to be part of the Global Solve Climate by 2030 initiative and to moderate this very important panel on green recovery, climate solutions, and a just transition. This webinar is also extra special because I will be sharing with you a project that Dr. Zida and myself and also some of our colleagues have been working very hard on, which is called the UM-Nottingham Bite-Sized Climate Action. This project has been developed in collaboration with the British High Commission Kuala Lumpur, supported by Ecoknights. And it's a series of uniquely Malaysian online modules designed to empower Malaysian youth to act for the climate. We have created videos, infographics, podcasts, and even TikToks focused around 6 key climate concern areas: electricity, forests, trash, food, transport, and most importantly, change. Through these modules, we hope to inspire our youth to make climate action personal. And now we're going to actually give you a quick sneak peek of one part of our project, which is a bite-sized quiz. So very soon you'll see a pop-up on your screen with 6 questions, each related to one of our module topics. So you'll have 2 minutes to complete this quiz, and then we'll come back and have a look at the results. All the best, and hope everyone can participate. All right, so the results are in. So we'll just have a quick look at the answers and see how all of us fared. So the first answer is, the correct answer is petroleum, which is not the highest answer that most of us got. So we need to check up on our knowledge of that. Number 2 is correct. It's about 20% of capacity actually for public transportation in Malaysia, which is quite low. The burger question, most people got it right. Beef generally would have the highest carbon footprint. Carbon sinks. Why are forests known as carbon sinks? Also, most of you managed to get it correct. Forests do convert carbon dioxide into plant-based materials. On average, around 30% of trash in Malaysia gets recycled actually. So actually we can be a bit more optimistic about our recycling rate. And according to the survey, correct, less than half of Malaysians believe that climate change is a very serious problem. So we hope that through this initiative today, we can increase that percentage by even a little bit, which would be meaningful. So now we will move on to the main event. So first of all, let me explain the format of this panel. I will first introduce all 3 speakers, who will then be given 13 minutes each to deliver their talks. During this time, you are all welcome to submit your questions either through the Q&A icon below or the chat box. But due to time limitations, unfortunately, each panelist will only answer 1 question live. But don't worry, we will follow up via email with written answers later. So please ask your questions and perhaps you will be the lucky one today. And no worries if you don't, it will still be answered. So our first speaker is Dr. Gary Theseira. Dr. Gary is Technical Advisor at the Malaysian Green Technology and Climate Change Center under the Ministry of Environment and Water. He holds a PhD in agronomy and has many years of experience in climate change and sustainability policy in the government sector. If you'd like to read up more about Dr. Gary, his full profile should be in the chat box. And in his speech, he'll be touching on issues related to 2 of our modules, electricity and transport. Our second speaker is Dr. Yasmin Rasyid. She's the founder and president of Ecoknights and sustainability director of Landlease Malaysia. She holds a PhD in sustainability science and has 2 decades of experience in community action for sustainability. Dr. Yasmin will be touching on trash and food in her speech. And last but not least, we have Mr. Benjamin Ong, Head of Exploration at the Accelerator Lab under the United Nations Development Programme. He is a Chevening CIMB scholar and was very active in environmental education and engagement while he was a student in UM and continues on this line now as well. Mr. Benjamin will be touching on forest and change in his speech. So now I would like to invite Dr. Gary to give his speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Varkkey. I believe my video is being, okay, there we go. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's coming up now. Okay, we can see you.
Wonderful. So first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Varkkey, for the kind introduction. It's a great honor to be invited to be part of University of Malaya's Global Engagement 2021 program, and also the Malaysia Solve Climate by 2030 program as well. I'm hoping to be here and be able to talk to such a very excited and very enthusiastic group of young people to whom the future really does belong. And I hope that will generate lots of questions for which we can generate some pretty good answers for. So let me go ahead and get right into the presentation. First of all, just the idea of solving climate. It doesn't matter by 2030 or by when, but how do we think of solving the climate emergency? If all parties to the Paris Agreement meet their NDC targets, then nationally determined contribution targets will be regard ourselves as having solved the climate emergency. What about if all parties to the convention achieve net zero emissions? Would that be solving the climate emergency? Would it be enough? Do enough parties have the sequestration ability to achieve net zero? And for the parties that don't have that ability, will they be able to cut down emissions to a level that will be able to achieve net zero? What about achieving net negative emissions? Sounds kind of strange, but all that has to happen is for your sequestration to be greater than your emissions. And there you are, you have negative or net negative emissions. Of course, we'd be much more confident saying that we're solving the climate emergency if all parties to the convention had absolute zero emissions. But I think what is really called for to reverse the trend of emissions and to undo the amount of greenhouse gases that has already been put into the atmosphere is that practically all parties will have to achieve absolute negative emissions if we are to return to greenhouse gas concentrations around 300 parts per million by 2100. Okay, but in actual fact, what's probably going to happen is that all parties are going to do whatever they are able to do, given the somewhat limited resources that they might possess. We cannot expect a country like Singapore that has limited number of amount of forests, forested land, to be able to have great sequestration power, nor can we expect any of the countries in dry climates to have the kinds of forests that can sequester carbon the way Malaysia can. And it's the same for corporate entities. When it comes to corporate entities, we might find that there are some companies that simply have to rely on the grid, the electricity. There's no way they can decarbonize the energy that they use. And so for them, achieving net zero emissions will be practically impossible. On the other hand, there might be companies that work with large swaths of land that might actually be able to use that land to sequester some carbon and offset some of the emissions that they might have. All right. So this is a slide that I use sort of to demonstrate how we are doing, or how we have been doing in terms of this concept of net zero emissions or net emissions. If you look at where my cursor is, above the y-axis is all the area where we have emissions, and these are color-coded by the sector that they're from. So you can see, of course, the greatest part of the emissions does come from the energy sector. Below the x-axis, you see this great light green area that is actually removals by forests or sequestration. And the difference between what is above and below is indicated by this solid red line that runs the length of the graph from 1990 to 2016, which is the most recent year for which we have data. And this comes from the third biennial update report of Malaysia. Right? So if you think that it's not possible for us to return to an area on the graph where we are either net zero or actually net negative, it was just, if you think about it, from 2004 to 2021 now, a good 16 years since we were actually net negative in terms of emissions. So if you're older than 16 years old, you actually grew up in a time when Malaysian forests were sequestering more carbon than the entire Malaysian population was emitting. And if we were able to do it then, without the benefit of Google and Google Maps and cell phones and highly efficient vehicles and highly efficient appliances, I'm more than confident that given the right education, given the right capacity building, and given the opportunities that Malaysia can and should take the lead in addressing climate change. Now, we are actually at a very interesting time in Malaysia in terms of addressing climate change. We do have a national policy that's under review. It's a 2010 policy, and so it's high time it was reviewed. Very interestingly, also the national energy policy is under review, and they should be finalizing it fairly quickly soon. There is a low carbon cities framework that's already under implementation in Malaysia, and the low carbon mobility roadmap has been approved. So when you think about the fact that I've actually been asked to speak to the concept, or rather two areas of energy and transportation in this webinar, it's interesting to note that both of those sectors are actually not under the Ministry of Environment and Water, but under the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources. I'll be happy to share with you the developments in these areas. In addition to that, we actually have the inaugural Malaysian Climate Action Council meeting that's chaired by the Prime Minister, Honorable Prime Minister, that happened yesterday. And we also had the roundtable discussion on the low emission pathway that was kicked off by the Ministry of Environment and Water yesterday as well. So essentially, if this webinar had taken place a week later, there would have been a wealth of information in terms of policy direction that probably would have been much more forthcoming and much more available. But I urge you all to look at the news, because a lot of things are happening and many things are going to be coming out from the government very soon. This is one of the slides that was actually presented yesterday by the Economic Planning Unit under the Prime Minister's Department. And if you look at it, it talks about the three major concerns about energy supply, and not just in Malaysia, but in any country. Okay, the first has to do with environmental sustainability, and here we're talking about, of course, CO2 emissions and the share of renewables or renewable energy in the primary energy mix. And these generally fall under the question as to whether or not the electricity supply in Malaysia is sustainable. If you look at in terms of energy security, how are Malaysians able to access electricity? Then we talk about accessibility. Do we have frequent outages? What are some of the challenges to getting electricity supply? And if we can get the electricity supply, how affordable is it? And this is where we talk about equity. Now, it's important to know that energy is not yet a human right. Energy in Malaysia is still a commodity, and commodities are produced by people at cost, and they have to be purchased. So what really governs then the amount of emissions coming from energy? What are the components of a useful equation that we can work with? Where should we focus our energies? And if we think about it, if you really want to reduce emissions from the energy sector, all we have to do is move less. It doesn't matter if we're moving electrons or moving elephants. Okay, all of energy is involved in moving things so that they change, right? So when we think about, should we adjust it from the standpoint of the energy we make or the energy we use? Sometimes we think about renewable energy and say, well, if we boost the proportion of renewable energy in our energy mix, okay, we can actually reduce the energy footprint. But on the other hand, there's also say, why not just simply use less energy? Won't that send a stronger signal to those producing energy? Has the development of the PV solar industry actually had an impact on the amount of electricity we generate from coal? Or on the other hand, does it simply add to the electricity supply and increase the so-called reserve margin of energy in the country? Or on the other hand, should it be something like less fossil fuel-based energy together with and less energy use? Right. So one example that I like to use for this is the so-called Earth Hour, which is a very interesting concept for building awareness and creating sensitivity to climate issues. But Earth Hour is the only time when we generate copious amounts of electricity and use none of it, which means that all the emissions from the power that's generated during Earth Hour are completely wasted, right? So the interesting thing also that's now developing is that consumers, as a consumer of electricity from the utilities, you are increasingly able to choose the kind of electricity you want, right? So what programs are already available in Malaysia? Well, if you want solar panel on your home, like this picture here, you can outright purchase a solar PV solar system for your roof, or you could subscribe to what is now called net energy metering, where you install it on your roof and then you buy the electricity that you need and you sell the rest to the grid. You would have solar rooftop leasing, where you actually lease your solar your rooftop space for somebody else to generate electricity. You could subscribe to the green tariff, which means paying a higher price for the electricity that you consume to ensure that the electricity that you're consuming is part of what comes from renewable electricity. For example, from one of our large-scale solar projects. Or you could, on the other hand, purchase renewable energy credits, which are credits that are generated from renewable energy independent power producers, right? So the idea really then is if you really want to cut down the energy used, or rather the emissions from energy, it's sort of what your mother told you when you were growing up and you were at the table and eating food. Take all the food you need, but use all the food, but eat all the food you take. In other words, buy the energy you need, but make sure you use what you buy in the most efficient manner possible. Don't buy excess energy if you don't need it, all right? So energy is really difficult to deal with in 13 minutes because it cuts across all the sectors, right? We use copious amounts of energy in our water systems. Every cubic meter of water that's supplied to your home actually comes with about 0.5 kilogram of greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 equivalents. And you could reduce your carbon footprint, your energy carbon footprint, simply by reducing the amount of water that you use. So when you think about it, the average Malaysian apparently uses about 250 liters of water per day. So that'd be 4 days. In 4 days' time, they will use a cubic meter of water. And that will emit about 0.5 kilogram of CO2. And if we think about it, we are using at present potable water to do things like water our plants, flush our toilets, and wash down our driveways, when that water could actually come from captured rainfall, which falls right on our roofs and comes with zero carbon footprint, right? So if you subtract all those uses from your monthly water supply, there's a strong chance that you could save a lot of energy simply by cutting down on your water use. Energy is used in our food systems, especially in not just in the production of food, where it involves fertilizer and gases like nitrous oxide and things like that. The transportation of the food, the packaging of the food, the refrigeration of the food, not just in the stores, but en route and then in our homes. So our food systems are strongly linked to energy use. And I think cooking is one of the amazing areas where we actually understand how much energy is used. So of course, if you have an open skillet or a saucepan and you've got your flame on high, you're heating mostly air, all right? But if you cook slowly and you cook with low amounts of energy, much more of that energy actually goes into the food that you're preparing, into the processing of that food, cooking of that food. And one of the most efficient ways to cook really is with pressure cooking, because then all the water that you convert to steam actually helps the cooking process, speeds the cooking process, so that eventually you use a lot less energy than you would otherwise. Okay, energy is intimately tied to our manufacturing. It's also tied to our information systems, and on a lighter note, it's consumed in social and cultural entertainment, as well as for mobility. And if you think of it also, there are extremely useful ways of using the energy, electricity that's generated, and ways that are less useful. If you look at the photograph to the right, you will see a typical scene on the rooftops of apartment complexes in China. And yes, those are solar water heaters. It's not high tech, it's not PV. Okay, but if you think of all collectively, all the electricity that's not being used in instant water heaters in every single one of these bathrooms, and multiply that by the entire city, you will find that it actually adds up to a lot of electricity. It's used needlessly when, once again, like the rain, the sun is shining on our roofs. And I'll bet that with all these water heaters in place, collecting that heat and putting it into all these tiny tanks at the tops of these water heaters, much less heat actually gets transferred to the building itself, making the building actually much cooler than it would be otherwise. So when we think about a green recovery then, yes, of course, we're dealing with COVID-19 now. We do want to come back greener than we went into the pandemic. And if we think about how we might be able to do just this, okay, we need to list down sort of all the changes that we've made in our lifestyle during this pandemic. We need to assess the shift in energy use that occurred. Of course, we commuted much less. We perhaps didn't run the office air conditioner as much. We probably ran the house air conditioner a whole lot more, right? So there's give and takes right there. We need to talk about changes in resource consumption. Okay, what did we end up using more of? Did we use up more gas cooking at home simply because we stayed home and cooked more? Okay, but was that a good thing? Because otherwise, if we kept ordering out, would it come with gobs and gobs of plastic, which would otherwise also require disposal and also has a carbon footprint of its own? Okay, we should also be identifying and piloting some of the potential solutions that we can carry on once the pandemic is over. And one of the things that we're doing, at least at MGTC now, is we have instituted a work from home Friday. So from now on, permanently, all employees will work from home on Friday, and we've already calculated that saves a significant amount of emissions in terms of commuting. We need to develop some of the greener industries that have popped up during the pandemic. We need to make sure that the just transition allows for the employment of people in these growing and new industries. And we need to integrate these into social and cultural norms so that they become part of our culture. Right now, I think you'd be surprised if somebody came close to you and wasn't wearing a mask. You'd be quite mortified. You'd be quite shocked. And this is because wearing masks has now become a social norm, social cultural norm in the very short period that we've been under this pandemic. So we oftentimes underestimate the speed at which we can change. And we need to make some regulatory changes to facilitate green mobility. For example, we do allow folding bicycles on our commuter trains right now, but the problem is they're not allowed during the rush hour, which is when most commuters would actually be going to work. And this is interesting because in many other countries, it's not just foldable bikes that are allowed on trains, but full-size bikes are allowed on trains as well. And it's amazing to me that you're allowed to carry 2 full-size suitcases on a train, when a folded bike actually takes up less room than 1 regular-sized suitcase. Okay, and we need to look at some regulatory restrictions and financial disincentives on some of the things that aren't so pleasant about COVID-19. For example, the amount of plastic generated with food deliveries and such. So moving on.
Dr. Gary, so sorry, your time is approaching.
Okay, very well. I think I only have a couple more slides. So we have some other mobility considerations that we perhaps could use to drive this further. One of the first is actually decongesting public busways, because if buses had lanes and cars had dedicated lanes and cars had to share lanes with the rest of the traffic, then buses might move a lot faster than cars, and that might actually get people out of cars and into buses because they wouldn't be spending so much time on public transport. We could also have things like express or terminal choices for light rail transit. At present, when you get on a light rail transit, you are required to stop at every single stop, whereas in other countries, either the train does not go to the terminal station, it stops sometime before, and then turns around and goes back. What this does is that it avoids a situation where you have full cars coming from the end of the line and people aren't able to get on. Okay, whereas if you have a car that turns around and goes back before it reaches the end of the line, lots more people could be ferried in the same amount of time. Also, you could have express choices. So you have trains that do not stop at every station, but stop at key stations, but get across the line much, much quicker than they would otherwise. So if you're traveling from one end of the line to the other, you could opt for an express option and get there a lot faster than you currently do. We could use more secure bicycle parking at some of the train stations or rental programs. And finally, you could talk to your boss and get commuting work time credit. So in summary, if we are going to address emissions from transportation, from energy in a serious way, we have to question everything. We cannot leave any stone unturned in the search for better ways of using energy, better ways of getting mobility done, better ways of addressing food security, water security, and energy security. We need to go on an energy diet and look at the areas where we are actually using energy without realizing it, using energy needlessly. We could vote with our wallet, and choose renewable energy over non-renewable energy or more carbon-intensive energy sources. We could talk to our employers about moving less, maybe get a work from home day or get credit for commuter time for work. And you could talk to your family and friends. That's very important. We need to get this conversation at a higher level. And I think that the video that we saw from Varkkey University really exemplifies this. The more we get this topic on the surface and even up to the level of when our elected representatives become more articulate in this issue, the sooner we'll be able to solve some of these problems. And finally, do stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gary. So we will keep the questions for later. Now we move on to Dr. Yasmin. Dr. Yasmin, you're invited to come on screen, please.
I'll quickly go to sharing my slides. Can you guys see this?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Can you make it large? Yes.
Yeah, I think it's getting there.
Okay, great.
I just need to move everyone's face to another side of the screen. Okay, so is it okay to start now?
Yes, please. Thank you so much.
I think I kind of probably have everyone at a time where we're thinking about this food. I know I am. That's the first thing I'm going to work on after this webinar is to go get things ready for berbuka puasa. Thank you, UM, for hosting this webinar series. In this session, I believe I will be sharing with you on two topics which I feel are kind of interrelated, which is food as well as trash. While I guess today in modern times, really have a lot of intimate relationships with food, food is also creating a lot of new age problems for society as well, for the environment. In the past, and I heard Dr. Gary say this earlier on about if you serve food in the past, in the 80s or 90s or 70s when you're growing up, as a child, you're expected to finish everything on your plate. No negotiation. And many of us, probably my generation, grew up with the narrative that if you don't finish the food, think about all the kids in Africa who don't have food. I think many of us remember that narrative. In the past, these are the face of the malnourished. Basically, you're talking about maybe 3 decades ago, there were a lot of unequal access to food. Food quality was different. But today, this is the face of the malnourished generation. We're definitely not starving, not like how it was in the past. We're definitely eating a lot more, but we're also eating a lot more less healthy meals in today's society. And I can't blame society. I think sometimes I fall into that statistic as well. If you're running late, you've got 45 minutes to get meals sorted for 2 hungry kids and yourself. To the drive-thru we go. And we compromise on quality with things that are quick to get, easy to get, affordable, cheap, because we don't have time. Subsequently, and I don't have to convince you this, but subsequently we've also seen the growth of a lot of modern day health challenges related to our changing diet. Another problem with food that we see today, my slide, is also something I personally have observed. I'm pretty sure many of you have as well. The kind of food choices we get today is a lot different from the past. A lot more sugar, a lot more artificial materials incorporated. I don't remember eating so much meat. I mean, looking at the growth of, like the meat houses and steak houses in the city center, it's quite shocking to see like the shell outs. It symbolizes a lot of abundance in terms of quantity. Another problem with food that we see, especially in Malaysia, is our dependency on suppliers. And majority of our food today, about 70% is imported. Export a lot of the good stuff, but we also import a lot of things into this country. When I was learning geography in primary school, I remember learning back then that we only have to like import 20% of food stuff to feed the population, but that number has reversed a lot in the last 3 decades. Our farmers are also getting older by age, and there is also a challenge to attract young talent into the farming industry. On top of that, the price is also increasing for food. What this word means to say is capitalism. I think capitalism is driving the way, is shaping how food is produced, managed, and consumed. And another challenge with food, as I mentioned just now, because a lot of our food is imported, right? It goes through a lot of traveling. Your salmon from Norway, your ikura from Japan, your amazing M9 Wagyu beef from Japan or Argentina, depending. A lot of our, your lobsters from like the northern part of our planet. So the further your food comes, the bigger the carbon footprint is, and the bigger the impact is on the environment. And this, I hope to see less of that tonight, wherever I am breaking fast. Wastage. I think this is a interesting era, a massive era of wastage, not just in food, but in energy, in a lot of things. I think in today's society, the big W is the $1 million question, and how do you solve wastage in society today? And we're at 7 billion people, and we're gonna continue to have this kind of human behavior being practiced. I can't imagine what will happen to this planet if we are reaching 9 billion of us and we continue with this attitude of wastage. So I don't know what to call this problem. Is it behavior? Is it attitude? Is it values? Is it, I think a lot of us are taught well in school about being mindful about what you throw, but this is still a really massive problem in terms of our food. And along with food wastage today, with the COVID-19 pandemic, with the reliance on express food sent to your home, we've also seen massive wastage in how we dispose of food containers, plastics, non-disposable plastics as well. So hence, that's why I think food and plastic always has an intimate relationship, because every time you take out, it's in the plastic container. That has caused a lot of pollution issues. We've seen from masks to food containers to food packaging. But the major problem that's going to impact how we produce food and how we eat food is climate change, of course. It's going to massively hit global food security. We have seen unprecedented extremities in the frequencies and magnitudes of weather patterns. Some areas that never get drought. Some areas that don't get heavy precipitation are now flooded. Also, in terms of food availability, there are still pockets of communities that don't have access to good quality food at affordable prices. You would think in this era that it's more fair play, but we still have those challenges in today's society. We're also seeing loss of natural resources in terms of our water and forests as a result of climate change. And this indirectly affects our agricultural land. And of course, the whole agriculture industry itself, in the name of producing us food, are also very good carbon emitters. They emit a lot in terms, if you like meat, you want cow farming to stay, And if the economies of scale works out that we shall maintain a lot more cow farms to cater to our food habits, then you're going to see definitely contributing a lot of methane concentrations in the environment. And of course, agriculture uses a lot of fertilizers. Fertilizers have a lot of nitrogen-based compounds, which of course contribute to global greenhouse gases. Sorry to bombard you with so many problems, but there is another problem I'm going to share with you related to food is around the area of education. I'm slightly guilty as well. I have 2 kids. Compared to my knowledge and understanding about farming and being hands-on, my kids definitely have less of that exposure. Is it parents at fault? Is it our education system? Why are children today getting more detached and further away from the very thing that really makes the planet survive, which is food, growing crops, and the whole economics around it? Is it because young people, millennials or youth don't find farming sexy enough? Must we always inject technology to make it more innovative so that it attracts the right people with the right skills and therefore contribute to a greener economy through employment? So many questions around education, but it is a problem that we need to start fixing if we need to look at fixing the food problem in this country. So what's the solution? Clearly this webinar is about green recovery, and I don't think a lot of solutions I'm going to offer you in this webinar series are really out of this world solutions. I'm just basically thinking 2 simple things, which is to re-educate and reinvent a lot of the way we think about technology, reinvent the way we apply technology in the right context. There's so much innovation in that space that you can really look at efficient food production at a minimal space. You can look at transforming how food travels by using the right kind of technology or transportation, just like how Tesla did it. It's not new technology, but it has been reinvented in the last decades to today. And it's still, you can tell that Tesla is still relevant in today's society. And I just wanted to perhaps just share that while I probably bombarded you with a lot of food-related, trash-related problems, and some 2 simple solutions, I like to inspire you that there are a lot of Malaysian startups, Malaysian companies, social enterprises, NGOs, civil society organizations that are in the forefront of creating a food revolution, whether it's about farming in a different method, whether it's about creating a resilient community, whether it's about reducing packaging needs, or it's about changing people's behavior in their consumption. I think Malaysia has a little bit of everything in this ecosystem. Maybe the challenge is connecting the dots with all the existing players to understand what needs to move in order to get from what you are in an ecosystem to a revolution. So really quickly, you may or may not have heard these brands or seen them in town before. You've got Pop Tani that's in the forefront of promoting aquaponics and urban farm, sustainable urban farming. You got Babylon that's really popular in the vertical farming space. You've got GrabCycle converting unwanted food. This is reinvention at its core. GrabCycle picks up groceries that are not in use, oranges, lemons, you name it. They basically pick up lemonades that people don't want to buy anymore in grocery shops and make lemonade out of it and sell it back. So that's an interesting business model they have there. You've got them for the last 20, 30 years, really promoting organic farming, educating people about the dangers of pesticides and toxic chemicals. You need these guys in the ecosystem. If you're ever in Taman Tun, there's urban hijau, really community farming, in mobilizing people to live and eat healthily. You've got Langit here that really looks at giving back economic opportunities to indigenous communities through rice farming in the hills. You've got guys that's like Zenzin, and it's a very popular commercial name. You've seen it everywhere. And then you've got guys that promote sustainable food management, production, consumption through tourism, through homestay, through also people like the Hive, educating communities and really encouraging people to shop responsibly without packaging. And then you've got the more, I won't say crazy ones, but very innovative ones like Ento Food, really reinventing how we consume protein. They produce crickets as the new source of protein of the future, as opposed to getting your protein from meat only. And then, of course, it's not so far. You already have restaurants in Singapore serving you printed meat, lab-based meats, basically. Memphis Meats is just one example. So you can see the diversity of the players that are in that ecosystem here. And I probably didn't do enough justice. There's a lot more within the Malaysian ecosystem and outside. I think the future is exciting when you look at food, and also how actually addressing the food revolution can perhaps be that stepping point to changing our packaging and plastic revolution for the future. I see these couple of things as something that is already here, and you can see these changes on the ground. The idea of food sharing concept, the idea of consuming or purchasing food farmed within your nearest community to minimize your miles. I can definitely see a lot of strong farming networks coming up, whether digitally or physically. And then during this pandemic, you really see a surge on interest in home farming as well. People realize in 3 weeks, you can actually grow something and harvest something. The pandemic got us for a year, and some of us are still working from home. So there's a lot of resources at home that can contribute to sustainable food production. Support your urban farm community. This is sprouting quite well in KL and outside KL. And of course, packaging as well. And these are some of the areas which I think are very exciting, which I hope Universiti Malaya, whether through a climate change perspective or through technology and innovation, will address in terms of providing what is the future of good food, good quality and safe food to feed 35-40 million people in the near future. What sort of efforts need to be in place to continue to produce food at its optimum capacity while consistently working on reducing environmental impact and creating positive social impact. Third thing, very important, is to maintain affordability of food. And I think I pretty much wrapped up that last session there. So in short, green recovery within food and packaging, I think, are quite intimately linked. I feel that climate change is already impacting the sector quite drastically. Farmlands are either being destroyed because of really climate risks that we see out there. And I think if there's anything at all, it would be perhaps looking at a lot more innovations from universities, coming from really good collaborative efforts among all the relevant stakeholders and players. So with that, I'll hand it back to Dr. Helena to continue with the next session.
Thank you so much. That was perfect timing. Thank you. Now we would like to pass over to our final speaker. Ben, please, the screen is yours now.
Thank you, Helena, and everyone, Yasmin, Gary, for your presentations. I think it looks okay. I can see my video, I can hear myself, but...
Yes, we can see you and hear you. Just a minute for your slide to come up, I think.
Sure.
Yep.
Are my slides showing?
Just a second. Yes, please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. You know, we may have had about a year of doing all these things remotely, but I think every session is always, you know, so always throws surprises, and you can never be too sure. Anyway, I would like to, I'm Ben from the United Nations Development Programme here in Malaysia, and I'm with the Accelerator Labs, which is a global network present in 91 UNDP offices around the world. And I'd like to share a bit on the two themes that Helena introduced earlier on forest and on change. My sharing is titled Renewing Our Relationship with Nature in Cities. Let's see if that goes. Yeah. Depending on how you know how familiar everyone is with forests and with the scene, the Ministry of Energy and Natural Resources, GETSA, last year, you know, pointed out that we've got about 55.3% of forest cover in Malaysia, and of course, depending on what measures you use, you know, the number might be a bit higher, a bit lower. And countless scientists, conservationists, advocates have made a very strong case over the years for the conservation of forests, and you know, it's a very, very big and vast topic, and I won't go too much into that today. But what I would like to talk about is really the intersection of what I think is forest and change. You know, where there are emerging trends that kind of point us into interesting directions the next 10 years could take, especially since we're talking about addressing climate issues by 2030. But first, I would like to share with you a report by the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. It's called the Human Development Report, or HDR, and UNDP has been publishing this since 1990, so for the last 31 years. The latest issue, 2020's HDR, was titled Human Development and the Anthropocene. But first, a bit of background here. When UNDP first created the HDR, it was really about finding a new way to measure progress. Instead of using GDP as the sole measure of development, UNDP ranked the world's countries by human development by looking at other indicators besides just GDP, looking at education and civil liberties and things like that, to measure human development. Now, last year, it was interesting because the decision to really focus on the Anthropocene, which is not a new concept, really stemmed from the pandemic, where COVID-19 exposed and exploited, inequalities in the system, structural weaknesses and gaps, and of course, threatens a lot of reversals in what we've been able to achieve in the last few decades or so. And so it's important to emphasize here that we're looking beyond incomes and beyond infrastructure. That development goes beyond what we normally think of in terms of the economy, in terms of physical infrastructure, cities, and so on. And the 2020 HDR argues that we live in an epoch where humans are consciously, knowingly shaping the planet more than the planet is shaping humans. And so when we think about the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, we really need to think about bold new paths and not just something that's a temporary fix. This is the Planetary Pressures Adjusted Human Development Index. And really what this chart here shows us is that countries that have higher human development, and usually these are wealthier countries, the moment you apply a handicap that is calculated based on their impact on the environment, CO2 emissions, material footprint, it drops a lot. So if you look at this diagonal 45-degree line, if a country does not have any pressure on the planet or very, very low, it would fall along this line. And so lesser developed countries fall mostly close to the line, but very, very high income countries, their score drops tremendously. So in Southeast Asia, examples of these are Singapore and Brunei, that generally have a very, very high human development index values, but once you adjust for the pressure directly or indirectly placed on the planet, it drops. So all this is saying that here at UNDP, we take very seriously the impact of a country on the environment when we're looking at the overall development status of the country. And so whatever development is aspired to, it has to put the planet first. All right, thus ends the short economics detour. Back to Malaysia. You may know that we are a highly urbanized country. 77% today of Malaysians live in towns and cities. And if you compare this to 1960, it was only about just above 25%. So in just over half a century, we've kind of inverted that. And cities are the foreseeable future. But where our influence can be is how cities develop, where they develop, and so on. I want to show you two images. This is a picture of the Klang Valley. Well, this is a Google time-lapse shot of the Klang Valley in 1988. Right? So for those in the audience who were alive then, if you were in Klang Valley, you might remember this. And this is what it looks like in 2018. So you see the great difference. Right? This is not surprising, probably. The Klang Valley has definitely grown tremendously, and as you know, cities do drive climate change directly or indirectly. As Gary and Yasmin have pointed out earlier. One of the other things that we will notice also here is that encroachment into forested areas has increased. Right? Whereas in the past, we find that there are buffers, agricultural land, and so on between the city and the forests. Those buffers are being quite significantly eroded year on year. And as buffers get eroded, this tends to increase risk of zoonotic diseases. It increases risks of local disasters like floods and so on. So it's important to think about how our actions in developing cities affect forests, affect ecosystems and biodiversity. The expansion of cities and encroachment into forested areas is not surprising. I think so much has been said about that. But I think what is interesting, if not surprising, is the observation of a return of forest ecosystems in unlikely places in the city. And I would like to share 3 examples in and around since UM is my alma mater, and a lot of thoughts I have today really started from explorations in and around campus. So if you are studying or working in UM, you can explore these places too. The first is Rimba Ilmu, UM's Botanic Garden. It really started out as a rubber plantation all those years ago, but it has over half a century become quite a regenerated rainforest with a stream, a water catchment area, refuge for wildlife, and so on. It's important to know, though, that this was a rubber plantation, in the 50s, at the time the university was established. Whether by intention or accident, nature was allowed space to breathe and recover. And this is significant because, if you were to rewind the time 70 years ago, it would not have looked like what it does today. The decision could have easily been made to just chop down the rubber trees, develop it, build on it, and so on. But because the decision was made, for whatever reasons it was made back then, today this forest garden is a world-renowned institution, and I think just last year, the year before, was approved as a national heritage site, and the process to gazette it is currently ongoing. But the question is, when we look around us at the city, when we look at a patch of green space like the one in this picture, that is neither here nor there, it's basically just secondary forest ecosystems, it's scrub, it's what we call in Malay beluka. Do we look at this as a potential future forest if we leave it to regenerate over 30 years or so? Or do we see it as future development? A lot of times when we talk about protecting forests, we talk about protecting forests that already exist and are already mature today. But how often do we talk about investing in the forests of the future or the potential forests to come? Second is this in observation section 12, PJ. You see this, this sea of tree canopy here, right? What does it look like? I mean, it could be a forest, it could be something else. It really isn't anything other than trees that have matured over the bungalows in that area. So you see in this picture here, there are houses that are basically taller than the trees around them. But in the distance, middle distance here, the trees have really grown much bigger. And so this was a site of a study that I did some years back in UM. And if you want to know more, there's a book published on it called The Backyard Before You. You can Google it. But basically what we found is that in this area, human activity and a forest ecosystem could coexist, because a kind of layering what happened, where in the 2 stories of the bungalows, that's where kind of humans lived and moved and did everything. But the trees had grown tall and mature enough so that there was this independent canopy layer that existed above the houses. And this could be something to think about how land may not be either or in a city, but you could actually have layers of activity, human activity, and also nature, plant and animal activity. This area was actually once earmarked to be a health metropolis, or extension of a hospital. This is Section 12 area. And of course, while medical services are essential for rapidly growing population, I think one of the things that COVID-19 taught us is that, first of all, disruption of natural ecosystems increases health risks, but also, and something that Yasmin pointed out just now, local green space is really an asset for mental and emotional health, especially as we saw last year. Communities that had access to parks or just green space nearby were arguably found it easier to cope with the MCOs and so on. And the final observation is this, that you might see in some, you can't see it here, but there's a heron in the water just around here. This is a typical urban drain, right? But what's not so typical is the vegetation growing on its sides. You'll find that some drains have vegetation like this and others have it all mown down and there's nothing left. These living riverbanks help to prevent erosion, absorb water, and they actually kind of play, perform those ecosystem services for the water systems in the city. But if you look at how development trends have changed in the last 20 or 30 years, you'll find that where significant buffers, natural buffers were incorporated into developments back then, today it's very little. Typical housing development in the 2000s looks a bit like this on the right, with just a little bit of token green space kept there because the developer has to, rather than worked into the ecology of the space. But we also saw a reclaiming of land during the various MCOs. There is the so-called guerrilla farming. I think there's only so much Netflix people can take. And as Yasmin said, the food revolution, people planted on balconies, people planted on road verges, the edges of drains, wherever anything could grow. Really terraforming urban residential space in interesting ways. All this is to say that, I believe we have a fractured climate because we have a fractured relationship with nature, a human-nature contract, if you will. And the 2020 Human Development Report outlines 3 mechanisms of change, including, and I think this is very important, and Gary touched on this earlier too, social norms, social cultural norms, what we expect of nature, what we expect of the forest, what we expect of the urban landscape. So what alternatives are there if we question it? What if we went away from the popular narrative of the smart city and talked instead about, say, low-tech or dumb cities? It's not to say, this is dumb in the sense of, being low-tech, not necessarily stupid, but in many ways, we make the city a very sterile place, if we're not careful. And this also ties back to Yasmin's point earlier about children and exploration, right? So just 2 things. What can we do, in the here and now, right? There's 2 things. I think one thing, we can change what we know about the city. Environmental activist Gurmit Singh, formerly, I think, of SETDEM, used to say, we need data, right? And the reality is that when it comes to forests and biodiversity and ecosystems in the city, we don't know all that much. And this year, the City Nature Challenge across the world comes back to Malaysia, in Penang, in Johor, and in the Klang Valley at the end of this month. So do look out for it. And it's an opportunity to explore and document the plant and animal wildlife that you encounter in the city. And knowing what life we have around us can change the way that we think about and manage the city. The second thing that we can change is what we expect of urban landscapes. And I think there are two narratives here: the narrative of the very clean, pristine, manicured landscape on the left, and the narrative of the wilder, of the more organic landscape that you see on the right, that, you know, where you don't sweep away dried leaves, but you use them as mulch, you use them to reduce evaporation of water from the ground, and you use them to, you know, condition and nourish the soil. The photo from the right was taken at Singapore Botanic Gardens, and this was part of a campaign to say, don't be alarmed, you know, don't think of these leaves as messy, but think of them as food for the soil, as a resource. And I like what Gary said earlier about using less, about kind of like, you can either generate more renewable energy or just use less energy. In the same way, we could waste a lot of energy sweeping up leaves and, you know, discarding them elsewhere, or we could just think of it as a resource and rechannel it back into the ground where the leaves have fallen, you know, instead of spending more energy transporting them or doing other things with them. But this also ties into children and exploration, right? Yasmin mentioned earlier that, you know, why is the children may not be so interested? And sometimes I think it's because we have very little wild space. Where there are leaves, and I used to lead environmental education program for children in the past. I used to remember bringing children into forested areas with lots of mulch, and when children stepped on leaves and the leaves crackled under their feet, children, you know, these children said, you know, it sounds so beautiful, and, you know, there's something very pleasing about the sound of leaves being crushed beneath your feet. And this tactile experience of nature is something we can still have in the city, but we have to change our expectations of the urban landscape. Fun fact, there was a poll done some years back on the most beautiful sound in the world, and turns out the winner was actually a Malaysian swamp. Where, city, forest, I don't know, but habitats, even like urban drains, can support quite a bit of life, including you know, amphibian life, frogs, and so on. So it's amazing what we can actually find just in our backyards if we look for it. In closing, and this is my last slide, I just want to bring it all home with two images that come from within, I don't know, within a 20-meter radius of where I live. On the left, you see a picture of a bulbul, a yellow-vented bulbul is a bird, one of in the city, you know, nesting in someone's flower pot. And on the right, this is literally the exact drain where I encountered my very first tadpoles several decades ago. And you know, you can be surprised at, you know, what life can come right up to our doorsteps if we create some space for it. And so what I've shown you is that the forest representing nature's forces is changing the cities and finding ways to adapt and live with us. But will we change? Will we welcome nature into the city and create cities where nature can thrive? Do we even want it here with us or not? I leave us on that note, and thank you for the opportunity to share. Do follow UNDP and the Accelerator Labs. Here are our social media handles. I think I might have gone a couple of minutes over, but thank you so much for being patient. And Helena, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. No, you were perfect timing. Thank you so much for that. And now we will move on to our Q&A session. As mentioned, I think we might only have time for one question for each speaker. So I will work backwards now. So I'll give a question to Ben first, if you don't mind. So the question is from one of our viewers. Is our society ready to pay ecosystem goods and services tax in return for the carbon sequestration and other services provided by our green environment?
Wow, this is, I barely have time to collect my thoughts. I think the question is in the Q&A, right? Maybe I can have a
yes, it is, and I'll also repeat it again.
Sure.
Is our society ready to pay ecosystem goods and services tax in return for the carbon sequestration and other services provided by our green environment? So sorry to put you on the spot.
No worries. Actually, I mean, I think Gary and Yasmin would have more to add on this. I'm sure this is, you know, familiar to you as well.
They already have. That's why I'm asking you.
I mean, I think this is a very general question. So if we're talking about society as a whole, if we're looking at is more than 50% of society ready, I think the answer is no. You know, but pockets of society, are there ways to introduce this? Maybe. But if we're going to, if I would say this, if any political party were to run on this in the next election, I don't think they will win lah. You know, so I think that's just the, you know, just the reality of things, that it's not something that that people in general, you know, with a critical mass are, I think, are ready. But there's a second part of the question: are tax legislations in place or in the pipeline? Prof. CP, thank you for the question. I don't think so, not as a whole, but I may be wrong. Yeah, again, I just want to know, I don't know if Prof. CP can clarify this, but this is a very general thing, right? So are we talking about individual consumers paying ecosystem goods and services? Or are we talking about like states paying ecosystem goods and services? You know, at what level are we talking about society? Because if we're talking about consumer taxes, I don't think there is anything specific on that just yet, but yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Maybe Prof. Siti can clarify in the chat. But is either Dr. Yasmin or Dr. Gary would like to add on to that question a bit more?
I've already answered the question, but be happy to add. I think that in pockets, as Benjamin has said, you may find Malaysians who do appreciate ecosystem services, either in the areas that they live, be willing to put up with I don't say put up, they're willing to actually enjoy the common spaces and share the common spaces and use them productively. So I didn't get a chance to talk about the closing image. Basically, that is a bitter gourd that I grew in a pot in my garden, and my son, you know, it became part of that process. So I think that there's a renewed growing appreciation of how ecosystems provide services to us, and what would actually be necessary to fortify, to encourage, to enhance some of these ecosystems so that they can continue providing these sorts of services. Yeah.
Thank you. Yasmin, anything from you at this point?
I just think the question's a bit odd, because instead of asking whether society is ready to pay for these kind of taxes, I felt it was probably appropriate to ask that question to private sectors as well. I think their footprint is bigger. Yeah. There should be perhaps some policies to look at them playing a bigger role in that tax arena.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to Dr. Yasmin for a question. The question is about plant-based meat, some kind of a high-tech question for you. Perhaps you can give some insight on this. So the question is, may I know if encouraging production of plant-based meat could reduce the emission of carbon footprint and prevent extinction of flora and fauna in Malaysia? Is this something possible for the future? Have you heard of this tech in Malaysia? And could this also be a way to get the youth to be more interested in farming?
Yeah, I think the youth are attracted to it because of that high-tech element, high innovation element. And I think I saw a question earlier on by Tuan, I can't remember, is it Tuan Haji? Sorry, I don't remember the name, but was saying why isn't farming attracting the young? I beg to differ. I think farming is attracting the young, but maybe from a very a different dimension, to be a CEO of a startup that has a good technology, that farms better, that introduces a more efficient way of farming. I think it's attracting the young. It's just that my perception was the people that were interested to grow food, that were hands-on, were aging population, right? And back to plant-based meats, I did hear in a conference in Magic probably just a couple of weeks that there were some small Malaysian startups. I don't know the kind of scale, but I know it's just across the shore. There are restaurants in Singapore already serving this, perhaps at 30 Sing dollars a meal, still not cheap. And you already, I think we're quite familiar that even fast food chains are going that direction with their non-meat selection. So I think it's quite exciting times to see this awareness that has pressured these brands to actually come up with non-meat alternatives. So I think there is a lot of room for opportunity in that segment.
Thank you.
I would love to, I would love to challenge maybe our fellow peers that's in this call or students to really look into how the universities can play a role in replacing meat meals.
Thank you. Ben, do you have anything to add to this question? Because you mentioned the urban farming angle.
Yeah, sure. This is the question in the chat, right? If I'm not mistaken. Just so I'm sure that we're looking at the same thing as well. I think I just want to build also on what Yasmin just said about universities reducing meat meals. I think there's in catering, we tend to take a lot of things as a given or take a lot of things for granted. We expect certain kinds of food to be served, and we kind of changing those expectations. I'm not sure where it would start, but I think what urban farming, what home gardening has potentially done, and again, this is conjecture, but it's helped us to understand the cost, or at least the cost of producing food in terms of energy, in terms of time. And I think that is good in terms of, food is not something you just buy off the shelf, right? It's something that takes time to grow, and when appreciating that, we can also start to think of food options that are perhaps more, I know it's a very general word here, sustainable, but food options that are perhaps less energy intensive, that we can grow on our own in our backyards and things like that, and that I believe will also have an effect on climate change. Of course, it's a bit lengthy, but you can imagine that scaling, that kind of practice growing, right? It's a bit more back to the kind of kampung backyard garden that people used to get a lot of their requirements from. I'm not sure that answers the question, but that was the thought.
Thank you. And and it answers one of the other questions as well that was on there. Yes, so now I would like to move on to Dr. Gary's question for Dr. Gary. And I will like to combine some of the questions that just came in. Dr. Gary, I know you just put an answer in, but I think this is important to hear from yourself in person. What are the current challenges faced by Malaysia in order to increase the renewable energy capacity in our energy supply mix? And I think this goes really well with another question that came in about how would you envision a just transition would look like for the energy sector for Malaysia? So challenges to the energy supply mix and also a just transition.
Oh, all right. Both extremely good questions. As you know, we as a country have been embarking on a policy of moving towards renewables. In fact, the renewable energy target of 20% by 2025 has now been surpassed with a 31% target. And we're thinking of moving to a 40% target by, I think it's 2030. Some of the criteria are a bit different. For one thing, I think hydro is being included, large-scale hydro is being included in the energy mix in terms of the calculation of renewable energy. But I think that the two major challenges are actually cost and regulations. For safety purposes, there are some products that are regulated quite tightly, particularly in the waste to energy space. And of course, the idea is once again to prevent these from moving into inappropriate uses. But we need to explore ways to make our regulatory frameworks more sophisticated. It's not simply that because something falls into the category of a scheduled waste or industrial waste that the fate of that material is prescribed in such a way that it can only end up in a secured landfill or something like that. We need to allow for young entrepreneurs to explore ways of innovative ways of using these materials, reusing these materials, upcycling these materials. I think one of the very interesting things I've heard recently is using recycled plastic that may not be suitable for food grade products to make water storage for rainwater, which would be used for flushing toilets and for watering plants and for cleaning driveways. So you don't have some of these challenges associated with food grade plastics when it comes to trying to recycle some of these things. So yeah, the other issue is cost, because cost is a very strange thing. When you have a waste from an agricultural process, for example, you have to pay someone to come and take it away, and that is a cost for whoever produces that waste. But find use for that waste and find value for the waste, find a way to monetize it, and suddenly the cost structure changes. So you find many people sometimes they come with a wonderful business plan for a waste product, and it makes perfect viable economic sense, and you run for 1 year and 1.5 years, and all of a sudden there's no more supply, and you ask yourself why, and it's simply because that people now, knowing that they do not have a waste product, but they actually have a commodity, have actually begun putting a price on that, and that has changed the business model. And all of a sudden, what was economically feasible is no longer feasible. But I think that continued innovation and some kind of more innovative, flexible regulatory framework that allowed for piloting of some of these initiatives would go a long way toward speeding the adoption of all kinds of renewable energy technologies in Malaysia, particularly surrounding biomass. Just to get that in.
Thank you so much. Okay, so we are approaching our end time. So I'd like to thank all our speakers for all their talks and also their patience in answering the questions. And to finish up, we have a small segment here just to bring you back again to the bite-sized climate action so that everybody will be inspired to act for the climate, hopefully. So now we're going to take you to our bite-sized climate action website for a sneak peek at what we have. We're going to be launching later this month. So please follow us on our social media channels so you'll get it when we are live. Our website should be coming up on the screen just in a few seconds. Yeah. So this is our bite-sized module for change. So this is how our modules work. So we have this website, and this is what you're supposed to do. You did a quiz just now. So very similarly, you will do a pre-module quiz to test how much you already know. And then you can go through our videos, infographics, podcasts, and also TikToks to learn and to be inspired. And at the end, you will try to improve your score with our post-module quiz, which is basically similar questions, the same questions, but now you see whether you have improved your score or not. And then you can dig deeper with our reading lists and resources. And then it's your turn to go out and act for the climate. So this is how our website looks like. They're already scrolling, so you would have been able to see all that, the quiz, the infographics, podcasts some of you already may know. So we got some prominent personalities to come and speak for us. We also have TikToks. Some of our students have been helping us with this. They have amazing, very inventive TikToks, and also reading lists and resources. So that's what we have. Hopefully that got you guys interested and excited. We'll be launching soon, and our social media links should be in the chat box either now or very, very soon. Finally, I'd like to remind and encourage all of you to use this recording of the Solve Climate by 2030 webinar and also our bite-sized climate action content to make climate a class, as you have heard earlier. So you can use this recording as a springboard to discuss regional climate solutions, energy justice, and a green recovery among your students, if you're educators, your classmates, your family, and your friends. So once again, a big thank you to our panelists and our co-organizers from Solve Climate by 2030, the International Relations Office, Water Warriors, the Department of Science and Technology Studies, the University of Nottingham School of Environmental and Geographical Science, and all the individuals behind the scene who have made this event a success. And of course, a huge thank you to all of you who had joined in. We have more than 100 participants, which is great for us. And do look out for our email with written responses to all of your questions. Good evening and selamat berbuka puasa in a few hours' time to our Muslim viewers, and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.